Seawater rushes through the boiler rooms of aircraft carrier USS Lexington. Fires rage beneath their decks. The siren wails ominously, jammed in the on position by an explosion. The first carrier battle in history is erupted on the Coral Sea, and Lady Lex is in deep trouble. With major damage and over 200 sailors claimed by Japanese bombs and torpedoes, Captain Ted Sherman's officers are suggesting they try to run, or even abandon ship. But Sherman knows that if Lexington bows out now, the Japanese will take Port Moresby, leaving Australia cut off and isolated, and throwing the Allies' chances in the Pacific into peril. The captain holds firm. As long as Lexington can keep launching aircraft and firing her guns, there's still a chance she can turn this around. Little does he realize that the greatest threat will not come from above, but is already silently sneaking through the ship's belly. USS Lexington, CV-2, was born from compromise and necessity. Originally ordered in 1916 as a battlecruiser, one of 6 massive warships designed to give the United States Navy unmatched speed and firepower. Her construction was halted before completion, and the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 imposed strict limits on battleship construction. The treaty negotiators, desperate to prevent another ruinous naval arms race, had inadvertently created an opportunity. Rather than scrap the partially built hull, the Navy decided to convert Lexington and her sister ship Saratoga into aircraft carriers. The transformation was revolutionary. Laid down at the Fall River Shipbuilding Company in Quincy, Massachusetts on January 8, 1921, Lexington emerged as something entirely new, a floating airfield that would help redefine naval warfare. Launched on October 3, 1925, she was nothing short of a Leviathan, 888 feet long, with a displacement of 36,000 tons at standard load, rising to 47,700 tons when fully loaded. Meanwhile, her turboelectric propulsion system was a marvel of engineering. 16 Yarrow boilers generated steam for 4 General Electric turbogenerators that powered electric motors driving 4 propeller shafts. During her 1928 sea trials, she exceeded her design speed, achieving an impressive 34.59 knots. Lexington could carry 78 aircraft, though this number would increase as the Navy learned to pack spare planes into unused hangar spaces. She was originally fitted with 8 8-inch guns and 4 twin turrets mounted above her flight deck, a compromise for admirals who still doubted whether aircraft alone could defend a warship. Her secondary armament included 12 5-inch anti-aircraft guns and various machine gun mounts. At her commissioning on December 14, 1927, Rear Admiral William Moffett, Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, made a prescient declaration, quote, "This great carrier represents a powerful instrument on the offensive. I'm convinced that a bombing attack launched from such carriers from an unknown point at an unknown instant with an unknown objective cannot be warded off by defensive aircraft based on shore." The 4th U.S. Navy vessel to bear the name of the Revolutionary War's Battle of Lexington would soon be affectionately known as Lady Lex, and she was ready to prove Moffat's prophecy correct. After fitting out and shakedown cruises, Lexington transferred to the West Coast, arriving at San Pedro, California on April 7, 1928. Throughout the next decade, she would help the Navy find out whether aircraft carriers could replace battleships as the dominant weapon at sea. Her turboelectric propulsion system proved remarkably versatile. In June 1928, she made a high-speed run from San Pedro to Honolulu in just 72 hours 34 minutes. When a drought caused Tacoma, Washington's hydroelectric power to fail in late 1929, the Navy sent Lexington north. For nearly a month, from December 17, 1929 to January 16, 1930, the carrier supplied over 4.5 million kilowatt-hours to the city's power grid, a publicity triumph that earned her the nickname oldest supplier of electric power in the Northwest. In June 1930, command of Lexington was taken over by Captain Ernest J. King, learning lessons about carrier operations that would serve him well when he later became Chief of Naval Operations during World War II. Under his leadership and that of subsequent commanders, Lady Lex participated in annual fleet problems, massive training exercises that tested revolutionary tactics. The most prophetic demonstration came on February 7, 1932, executed a perfectly coordinated dawn attack on Pearl Harbor without being detected. The 2 carriers launched a massive Sunday morning airstrike that caught the defenders completely by surprise. Naval planners studied the exercise carefully. 6 years later, in March 1938, the carriers repeated the feat, again striking Pearl Harbor at dawn, and then turning to attack San Francisco, all without the defending fleet spotting them. During her first decade of service, Lexington also proved her versatility in unexpected ways, including delivering humanitarian aid when an earthquake hit Managua, Nicaragua, to contributing aircraft to join the massive search for aviator Amelia Earhart. But by 1940, with war raging in Europe and tensions rising with Japan, the Navy's priorities became clear. When Fleet Problem 21 concluded in May, Admiral Kimmel ordered the fleet to remain in Hawaii as a deterrent to Japanese aggression. Lady Lex's training days were over. On December 5, 1941, Lexington departed Pearl Harbor, carrying 18 Marine Vought SB-2U Vindicator dive bombers, bound for Midway Island. Task Force 12, the carrier, 3 heavy cruisers, and 5 destroyers, steamed westward under Rear Admiral John Newton's command, part of the routine reinforcement of America's Pacific outposts. 2 days later, about 500 nautical miles southeast of Midway, the radio crackled with stunning news. Pearl Harbor was under attack. Captain Frederick Ted Sherman, Lexington's commanding officer since June 1940, faced an immediate crisis. His flight deck was packed with Marine aircraft, leaving no room to launch or recover his own planes. As Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Sherman made an unorthodox decision. He reversed the fate of the ship's electric propulsion motors and steamed full speed astern, launching fighters to maintain combat air patrol, and switched forward to recover them. This unconventional maneuver, steaming backward at high speed, allowed him to maintain continuous air defense without the lengthy process of repositioning dozens of aircraft on the crowded flight deck. Lexington launched search planes, hunting for the Japanese carriers, but found nothing. The enemy had already turned north toward home waters. On December 13th, Lady Lex finally entered Pearl Harbor. The devastation was overwhelming. Oil inches thick on the water, capsized battleships, the pungent smell of smoke and fuel still hanging in the air. But there was no time to mourn. The next day, Lexington sailed again as flagship of Task Force 11, ordered to raid Japanese bases in the Marshall Islands and create a diversion for the desperate attempt to relieve Wake Island. The relief mission ended in frustration and tragedy. Wake Island fell to Japanese assault on December 23rd before the relief force could arrive. Vice Admiral William Pye, acting commander at the Pacific Fleet, ordered both task forces to return to Pearl Harbor rather than risk the precious carriers. Lexington arrived back on December 27th, having drawn no blood. January 1942 brought more disappointment. A planned attack on Wake Island had to be canceled when the submarine I-71 torpedoed and sank the oiler Neches on January 23rd. Without fuel for the return journey, the raid was impossible. Lexington spent weeks conducting fruitless patrols, her crew frustrated at their inability to strike back at the enemy who had devastated Pearl Harbor. But that was about to change. In February, Admiral Nimitz ordered Lady Lex back on the offensive. On February 20th, 1942, Vice Admiral Wilson Brown led Task Force 11, centered on Lexington, toward Rabaul, the massive Japanese base on New Britain. The plan was to launch a surprise carrier strike against enemy shipping and installations. But around 10 a.m., approximately 400 miles from the target, Lexington's radar detected an enemy flying boat shadowing them. Fighters shot it down, but not before it radioed a contact report. The second H-6K flying boat arrived to confirm the sighting. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Thatch intercepted and destroyed it, but the damage was done. Admiral Brown canceled the raid, knowing a surprise was lost. At 4:25 p.m., Lexington's radar picked up a large group of aircraft approaching from the northwest. 17 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, loaded with 550-pound bombs, every torpedo bomber from the 4th Air Group at Rabaul. The carrier's flight deck was crowded with fully fueled aircraft being prepared for operations, a catastrophic fire hazard if even one bomb struck. As the deck crew scrambled to move aircraft aft and launch additional fighters, Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare and his wingman climbed to intercept the incoming raid. It was the two of them against 17 bombers. O'Hare's wingman squeezed his trigger, but nothing happened. His guns had jammed. He banked away, leaving the 27-year-old pilot to face the formation alone. The Betty bombers came on in tight formation, their bomb bays loaded, bearing down on Lexington. O'Hare didn't hesitate. He rolled into an attack run, closing to point-blank range where he couldn't miss. His 650 caliber machine guns roared to life, tracers streaming into the lead bomber. The Betty exploded, pieces tumbling through the sky. O'Hare pulled up, swung around, and dove again. Another bomber disintegrated under his fire, then another. The Japanese formation began to break apart, pilots desperately trying to evade this lone American who seemed to be everywhere at once. A fourth Betty caught fire and spiraled into the sea. Then O'Hare's guns found another, tearing through its fuselage until it fell away, burning. In just 4 minutes, he had destroyed 5 bombers. The surviving Bettys pressed their attack, but O'Hare's aggressive assault had disrupted their entire formation. Only 4 bombers reached Lexington. All their bombs missed. Wildcats and anti-aircraft fire shot down every one of them as they fled. Of the 17 bombers that had launched from Rabaul, just 3 limped home. O'Hare had single-handedly saved Lady Lex. He would receive the Medal of Honor, becoming the Navy's first air ace and a national hero. When workers at the Grumman plant in New York heard the news, they sent him 5,000 cigarettes in celebration. 3 weeks later, on March 10th, Lexington joined Yorktown for a strike against Japanese shipping at Lae and Salamaua on New Guinea's coast. The attack was a success. 3 transports sunk and several other vessels damaged, but it was a small victory in a deteriorating situation. By late March, Lexington returned to Pearl Harbor for a desperately needed refit. Her 8-inch gun turrets were finally removed and replaced with quadruple 1.1-inch anti-aircraft guns. Meanwhile, Allied codebreakers at Pearl Harbor had achieved a critical breakthrough, cracking the Japanese JN-25 naval code. By mid-April, Commander Joseph Rochefort could tell Admiral Nimitz exactly what was coming. Operation Mo, a massive Japanese offensive to capture Port Moresby on New Guinea and Tulagi in the Solomons, scheduled to begin around May 3rd. Nimitz had only 2 carriers available. Saratoga was still under repair. Enterprise and Hornet were thousands of miles away with Admiral Halsey. He ordered Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher to take Yorktown south, while Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch would bring Lexington. Task Force 17 would face the Imperial Japanese Navy's 5th Carrier Division, the fleet carriers Shokaku and Suikaku, in a desperate attempt to stop Japan's southward advance. On April 15th, Lexington sortied from Pearl Harbor, her crew all too aware that the real test was finally coming. By early May, Task Force 17 had rendezvoused in the Coral Sea, Lexington and Yorktown together, backed by cruisers and destroyers. On May 3rd, the Japanese seized Tulagi in the Solomons. Admiral Fletcher raced north with Yorktown and launched strikes against the invasion force the next day, but the results were disappointing. Only a few smaller vessels sunk. More importantly, the strikes revealed to the Japanese that at least one American carrier was in the area. Both sides spent May 5th and 6th searching desperately for each other through squalls and heavy weather. The Americans knew from intelligence that Shokaku and Suikaku were somewhere to the north, along with the light carrier Shoho protecting the Port Moresby invasion force. But the vast expanse of the Coral Sea swallowed ships like ghosts. May 7th dawned with both fleets still hunting. At 7:22 a.m., a Japanese scout plane spotted what its pilot reported as a carrier and a cruiser. Admiral Takagi immediately launched a full strike. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers roaring off the decks of his fleet carriers, but the pilot had made a catastrophic error. His targets were the oiler Neosho and the destroyer Sims, separated from the leading American force. The Japanese attack was merciless. Sims went down with nearly all hands, and Neosho was left a burning hulk, drifting with survivors clinging to life. Meanwhile, an American scout from Yorktown made his own error, reporting 2 carriers and 4 cruisers to the northwest. Fletcher didn't hesitate. He launched everything. Lexington and Yorktown sent 93 aircraft roaring north toward what they believed was the main Japanese carrier force. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, leading Lexington Scouting Squadron 2, was the first to realize the mistake. The reported carriers were actually cruisers. But then, at 10:40 a.m., his scouts spotted something else. Shoho, the light carrier, steaming with her escorts toward the Jomard Passage. The American attack was devastatingly coordinated. Dixon's Dauntlesses screamed down from 10,000 feet, while torpedo bombers from VT-2 split to attack from both sides. Shoho twisted and turned, but there was no escape. 2,000-pound bombs penetrated her flight deck and exploded in the hangars, igniting fueled aircraft. 5 torpedoes slammed into her hull, flooding engine rooms and knocking out power. Yorktown's aircraft arrived moments later to finish the job. In less than 10 minutes, Shoho was mortally wounded. At 11:31 a.m., she rolled over and sank, taking 600 of her 800 crew with her. Dixon's voice crackled over the radio with one of the war's most famous messages, quote, "Scratch one flat top." But the day wasn't over. As darkness fell, the Japanese launched 27 bombers and torpedo planes, hoping to find the American carriers for a twilight strike. The weather turned foul, visibility collapsed, and the Japanese became hopelessly lost. Incredibly, several enemy aircraft, mistaking the American ships for their own in the darkness, actually attempted to enter Yorktown's landing pattern, flashing their signal lights for permission to land. American gunners opened fire, sending them fleeing into the night. Of the 27 Japanese aircraft that launched, only 18 made it back. 6 had been shot down, and 3 more had simply vanished into the storm. On May 8th, dawn broke over the Coral Sea, with both carrier forces searching desperately for each other. At 8:22 a.m., a Japanese scout plane spotted Task Force 17. Almost simultaneously, at 8:28 a.m., an American scout from Lexington reported 2 Japanese carriers, 4 heavy cruisers, and numerous destroyers bearing 028 degrees, 175 miles away. The race was on. Both sides began launching their strike groups around 9 a.m. 121 Japanese aircraft heading south, while 122 American planes roared north. They passed each other somewhere over the empty ocean, each group intent on destroying the other's carriers before their own ships were hit. The American strike found Shokaku and Zuikaku around 11 a.m., but the weather played favorites. Zuikaku slipped into a convenient rainstorm and disappeared, leaving Shokaku to face the full fury of both American air groups alone. The coordination wasn't perfect. Yorktown's dive bombers arrived first and attacked without waiting for the torpedo planes, but they scored hits. 3,000-pound bombs crashed through Shokaku's flight deck. One of them dropped by Lieutenant John Powers, who flew so close to the enemy carrier that his Dauntless was consumed by the explosion of his own bomb. The New York-born pilot had vowed to, quote, get a hit if I have to lay it on their flight deck. He kept his promise and received a posthumous Medal of Honor. Lexington's aircraft arrived to find Shokaku already burning and turning in circles, her flight deck twisted and unusable. They added another bomb hit, but the torpedo attacks from both carriers failed. Not a single torpedo found its mark. The Japanese combat air patrol was deadly, shooting down 3 Wildcats and 2 Dauntlesses, but Shokaku was out of the fight, limping away with fires blazing and unable to launch or recover aircraft. Now, it was the American carrier's turn to face the storm. At 10:55 a.m., Lexington's radar picked up the incoming Japanese strike. 69 bombers and torpedo planes. Wildcats and Dauntlesses scrambled to intercept, but there were too many attackers. Around 11:15 a.m., the Japanese torpedo bombers swept in low from both sides of Lexington in a perfectly coordinated anvil attack. Captain Sherman twisted and turned his massive ship, but at 888 feet long, Lady Lex couldn't dodge them all. The first torpedo slammed into her port bow at 11:18 a.m., jamming both aircraft elevators in the up position. The shock started with small leaks in the port aviation gasoline tanks. 2 minutes later, the second torpedo hit opposite the bridge, rupturing the main waterline and flooding 3 boiler rooms. Lexington began listing to port. Then the dive bombers arrived. 19 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers screamed down through the anti-aircraft fire. One bomb struck the port side near the forward 5-inch gun mount, detonating in the ready ammunition locker and taking out the entire gun crew. The second bomb hit the funnel, doing minor structural damage, but claiming the lives of machine gunners positioned nearby. The blast jammed the ship's siren in the on position, adding its wail to the chaos of battle. By 11:40 a.m., the attack was over. Lexington was listing by 7 degrees. 3 boiler rooms were flooded. Fires burned below decks, and 216 men were gone. But she was still making 25 knots. Her damage control teams corrected the list by pumping fuel to the starboard side. The fires were brought under control. Most incredibly, she began recovering aircraft at 11:39 a.m. Damaged planes and those low on fuel landing on her scarred deck as if nothing had happened. For over an hour after the attack ended, there was reason for hope. Damage control parties worked frantically below decks, shoring up bulkheads and fighting fires. The list had been corrected. Aircraft continued landing and taking off. At 12:43 p.m., Lexington launched 5 Wildcats to relieve the combat air patrol. 9 more Dauntlesses were being fueled and armed on the flight deck for another strike. Captain Sherman surveyed the damage and made his report. Lady Lex could make full speed if needed. She would survive, or so he thought. At 12:47 p.m., the ship suddenly convulsed. A massive explosion deep within Lexington's hull shook her from stem to stern. Sparks from a generator motor had ignited gasoline vapors seeping from the cracked aviation fuel tanks damaged by the morning's torpedo hits. The blast ripped through the ship's interior, taking 25 lives instantly and knocking out the main damage control station. Power circuits severed. New fires erupted throughout the forward sections, but flight operations continued. The 9 armed dauntlesses roared off the deck. 6 more Wildcats landed to refuel. Returning aircraft from the morning strike began touching down at 1:22 p.m., and within an hour, all surviving planes were back aboard. The crew worked with desperate efficiency, as if refusing to acknowledge that their ship was on its last legs. At 2:42 p.m., another tremendous explosion rocked the carrier. This one was worse. Severe fires erupted in the hangar deck, fed by ruptured fuel lines and ammunition. The forward elevator, already jammed, was blown upward, jutting 12 inches above the flight deck. Power failed throughout the forward half of the ship. Admiral Fletcher, watching from Yorktown, sent 3 destroyers to assist. Captain Sherman ordered the forward machinery spaces evacuated. The temperature in the engine rooms had climbed past 160 degrees. Men were collapsing from heat exhaustion. At 3:25 p.m., yet another major explosion tore through the ship, this one knocking out water pressure to the fire hoses in the hangar. Without water, the firefighters were helpless. Flames spread unchecked through the lower decks. By 4 p.m., the compartments below the waterline had been evacuated. Lexington drifted to a halt as fires consumed her from within. The heat was so intense that paint blistered and peeled from her hull. Ammunition began cooking off, sending random explosions through the ship. At 5:07 p.m., with flames visible through every hatch and the carrier's fate sealed, Captain Sherman gave the order to abandon ship. The crew had fought for over 5 hours to save Lady Lex. Now it was time to save themselves. The evacuation of USS Lexington was a study in discipline that bordered on the surreal. While fires raged below and explosions echoed through the hull, the crew assembled at their designated muster stations with almost parade ground precision. A few men organized their shoes in a tidy row on the flight deck before descending ropes into the water. Others, with time to spare before their turn to evacuate, decided to make the most of the situation. Seaman First Class James Finney and his group had been assigned to wait. They were standing on the flight deck when someone had an idea. The ship's service store, the Gadunk, was just below, and it was full of ice cream. The hatch was locked, but someone grabbed a fire axe and smashed it open with a single blow. The men filled their helmets with ice cream and passed them up to the flight deck. Aviation metalsmith Julius Harry Frey had the same thought. He rolled off the flight deck into the next level down, broke the Gadunk with an axe, and loaded his helmet with pineapple ice cream before tossing it up to his buddies above. When the muster call came, the entire group was sitting on the flight deck of their dying ship, calmly eating ice cream as if they were on shore leave. The scene might have been comical if it weren't so heartbreaking. These men knew what they were losing. Lady Lex had been home for years. At 65 feet above the water, the descent was treacherous. Men climbed down ropes hand over hand, many burning their palms on the way down. The ship's emergency life rafts had been pulled from aircraft still on deck, inflated and thrown overboard. Once in the warm coral sea, sailors swam to the rafts and waited for rescue. The destroyers Morris, Anderson, and Hammond moved in close, their crews throwing lines and hauling exhausted men aboard. Many sailors were coated in fuel oil and had to be scrubbed down on the destroyer decks. The rescue was remarkably efficient. 2,735 officers and men were pulled from the water, but 216 of their shipmates would never come home. Captain Sherman and his executive officer, Commander Morton Seligman, made a final inspection of the ship, checking every space to ensure no wounded men had been left behind. Sherman's Cocker Spaniel, Admiral Wags, who had his own muster station under the captain's bunk, was carried off by his master. Around 6:30 p.m., satisfied that everyone still alive had been evacuated, Sherman became the last man to leave his ship, climbing down a rope at the stern. However, Lexington couldn't be allowed to sink on her own. She was too visible, a beacon that might draw Japanese forces to the vulnerable rescue operation. Admiral Fletcher ordered the destroyer USS Phelps to finish her. Over the course of 38 minutes, Phelps fired 5 torpedoes into the blazing carrier. At least 3 found their mark. At 7:52 p.m., USS Lexington, the ship that had taught the U.S. Navy how to wage carrier warfare, rolled slightly to port and slipped beneath the waves in 2,000 fathoms of water. She went down on an even keel, with her head up. As she disappeared, one officer is said to have murmured, quote, "Dear old Lex, a lady to the last." 20 miles away, the shock of her final underwater explosion could be felt aboard the heavy cruiser in New Orleans. The loss of Lexington was a devastating blow to the U.S. Navy. With only 3 carriers in the Pacific Fleet before Pearl Harbor, America could ill afford to lose one. The Battle of the Coral Sea had cost the United States a fleet carrier and the destroyer Sims, with the oiler Neosho scuttled afterward. The Japanese had lost only the light carrier Shoho. In terms of tonnage sunk, Japan could claim a tactical victory. But the strategy told a different story. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese offensive had been turned back. The Port Moresby invasion force, stripped of its carrier support after Shoho's sinking, had retreated to Rabaul. Australia and New Zealand would not be isolated from their allies. More critically, both Shokaku and Zuikaku, stripped of their aircraft and with Shokaku heavily damaged, would miss the Battle of Midway a month later. The absence of those 2 fleet carriers at Midway would prove catastrophic for Japan. Lexington's sacrifice had not been in vain. In June 1942, workers at the Fall River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, where the original Lexington had been built 21 years earlier, petitioned Navy Secretary Frank Knox to rename one of the new Essex-class carriers under construction from Cabot to Lexington. Knox agreed. On February 17, 1943, the 5th USS Lexington, CV-16, was commissioned and assigned to the Pacific. She would serve with distinction throughout the Pacific War and beyond, eventually becoming a museum ship in Corpus Christi, Texas, where she remains today. Meanwhile, the original Lady Lex rested undisturbed for 76 years. On March 4, 2018, an expedition funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, aboard the research vessel Peril, discovered her wreck at a depth of 3,000 meters, more than 500 miles off the coast of Queensland, Australia. The vessel's nameplate on the stern confirmed her identity. The wreck lies separated into sections on the seabed, the main hull upright, the bow and stern broken off but nearby. Most remarkably, the expedition found 11 aircraft, 7 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 3 SPD Dauntless dive bombers, and 1 F-4F Wildcat fighter. The Wildcat still bore the Felix the Cat insignia of Fighting Squadron 3, Butch O'Hara's squadron, along with 4 Japanese flags marking aerial victories. The cold, dark water preserved them so perfectly that the paint looked fresh.